I'm assuming that you guys asked me to speak today because I have produced collectively a major film journal, Jump Cut, for over 40 years. And then after my two co-editors died, I've continued this project alone. So I'd like to talk about a little bit about that project and what I've learned about collective process. The first thing that I learned about collective process is that it's most effective if it's task-oriented. That is, you can produce a text, a video, teach a skill, teach a class collectively. And this project oriented toward a task has one thing, which is you provide a socially useful service which is needed and which you think is politically important and usually resistant or contesting the dominant. And the other is that doing a socially useful task makes everybody want to participate and also reduces the effect of potential conflict on the collective process itself. That is, because everybody's committed to the task, they put aside their differences for the while that it takes to do that task. Now, in the case of Jump Cut, that this task was, in the historical context of the time, part of both the alternative press movement and part of the counterculture, which had developed in the wake of the Vietnam War and with the rise of the New Left and the feminist movement. So that the process of putting out the magazine was also very important to us. Now, in our case, the early stages of Jump Cut were influenced by the ideals of collectivity that were part of the counterculture in the 70s and 80s. And then we also had the luck and perhaps the wisdom to have a sense of it being a vanguard project, something that would help film studies develop in a progressive direction, film studies being just getting started at that time, and then later had some notions of what was needed within film studies, so that we were image heavy. We were one of the early publications to go electronic. We got all of our back issues online early, and those have been very useful for teachers. One of the things that we foresaw less, but it could have been predictable, was who would be our writers. In other words, we have a steady stream of writers from assistant professors, contingent faculty, academics, film lovers, but especially assistant professors and people who wanted to advance in the academic profession. Because we were dedicated to putting out a publication, and this would also be true of collectives that make media, one of the issues is timely completion. And another is funding and decisions about funding. In that sense, we were an organization that always exerted a certain amount of control from the leadership in order to make the publication appear in a timely manner. And in addition, the three co-editors, John Hess, Chuck Kleinhans, and myself, each put into the project $1,000 per issue. And because John Hess was a good business person, that lasted over the source of the 40 years. So it's really been very economical. Also, we had some experience in the underground press on campus before that, and we knew how to produce technically the product in an inexpensive way. At this time, there were two technological developments which we relied upon. One was the introduction of the laser printer, which allowed us to produce text which was very highly legible in printing. And the next was the importance of photo offset printing for the low end of press runs. It's the kind of printing that you get in your grocery flyer every week that appears on your doorstep. And it is, the early issues were of Jump Cut, as well as much of the underground press, was printed on tabloid paper with this process. Because we provided the funding push to get timely completion, and we're putting in the most time on the project, we were privileged, and our class position allowed us to do this. And also, Chuck and I were deliberately childless, and John Hess was childless after a divorce. And so we did not have the responsibilities of family, and we remained relatively autonomous. We also did not pursue grants because we always wanted to live within an income that we could afford. And the way I described it is we were tithing for our political project. I want to talk a little bit about collectives in that period of especially the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and what it meant to work in a collective. First of all, there's a utopian aspect to it, and since I had that experience, though that utopian aspect has been very important to me for the rest of my life. That is, if you think that there's a better way to be living than the consumer society which we have under capitalism, then you may be motivated to seek it out, to live in another way, to prefigure what you want in the future. And intellectually, it's very exciting because you feel like you're breaking new ground. You are developing new processes of teaching yourself, of learning things, of re-seeing many things which you had taken for granted. And if you are developing a product, a media, a class, a journal, an essay, then you're breaking new ground, and you're presenting things that were not officially established or sanctioned or even thought about, and you're doing it in a participatory way, and that participatory way with other like-minded people or other people who have the same experiences shapes and reshapes your identity, both personally and what you're doing for others. And this may be in terms of reinterpreting the past or creating new structures for presenting information, learning, or social change. That's very heady and has a long-term effect on the people who participate in this kind of intellectual process and this kind of social movement. So that kind of utopian thinking, I think, underlies many, many collective projects. collectives have lifespans. They begin and they flourish and they end. And most of us have seen the end of some collectives that we were working in. And I think that that's important to think about. I'll talk a little bit about what I think kills collectives. But in any case, people have different motives for joining collectives. Sometimes it's exciting to meet people and get new ideas and work toward a common goal. Sometimes you have experiences that you want to share with other people who've had similar experiences. Sometimes you want to learn new skills. It's a group process that allows you to empower yourself in some ways, to gain new strengths, and it is a way of sharing your own work with other people. Now that as people work in collectives, I think I've just learned some things from practical experience. Chuck and John and I all come from German backgrounds with the notion of Gemütlichkeit, which means that you get together and you have a good time and you usually have a meal and it's usually plentiful food. So that almost all of our meetings had lots of food available. I attribute this to collective success. I mean, I think part of collective success means being good hosts whenever you get together. The collectives also had a nice mix of personalities, and they got along pretty much because they were committed to intensive work on this task that you all got together before. And because the task was being shared in a concrete and process-oriented way, people learned new things. In other words, if somebody worked on jump cut, they would learn how to put out an underground paper. I worked in the underground press in college before I worked on jump cut, before we founded jump cut. And so I learned how to put out the underground press there. Characteristic of collectives at that time was excuse me, I'm going to drink of water. Was consensual decision-making following long discussions, very long discussions, with a commitment to what we considered democratic process. As I mentioned previously, the editor's control meant there was a limit to democratic process, and I think that's necessary. I think if you're making a film, only one person can be in the editing room, or maybe an editor and a director, but yet it can't do collective editing and get out in a timely way. And that discussion-based decision-making meant that the process of discussion was shaped by constant feedback. In particular, when we got together, there would be a stack of manuscripts, and people would take manuscripts and read and comment on them, and we'd have out some blank paper. Everybody could write on a piece of blank paper what their comments were. Some people would read 3 or 4 manuscripts. Some people would stick with one manuscript for the entire time we worked together. We usually worked together on a Saturday afternoon. We'd work together for 3 or 4 hours and then have a meal together. It is, however, and then at the end of the day, we would have a discussion of how our work process went for the day. Now, I say we had a discussion on how our work process went for the day, but in fact, one of the ways collectives break up was that we were all quite enchanted with the Maoist idea of criticism, self-criticism. But in fact, if you ever criticized someone for bad politics or bad behavior, they would just drop out of the collective. And so an easy way to get someone to drop out of the collective would be to criticize them for their bad behavior. And the stories abounded for how people dropped out of collectives because they were criticized. What we didn't see in terms of this collective was two things. One is issues of, no, more than two things. Issues of race. That discussion of how things are going really doesn't allow for a person of color to say, I'm so tired of having to deal with all you white people and your problems all this whole space on an afternoon, even though I agree with the project that you're working on. And I know a collective in town where this actually happened, where a person of color said that, and then everybody said, oh, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? When they just didn't want to understand that that was part of the fabric of this person's life. The other thing about these labor-intensive sessions, especially the long drawn-out discussions of process, is that people with children have family responsibilities, and now people who are contingent faculty or graduate students have a lot of fiscal problems and have to work at other jobs and don't have the time for this kind of luxury of prolonged democratic process. I think that another aspect of how collectives break up in that process is actually a tactic of the government in planting agents inside of a process, which is one person will say, oh, you are all so middle class. You don't have any respect for working class people. How are we people who are working class, how do we fit into your ideology of always working in academia and using these big words, etc.? That a common provocateurist tactic is to pick up some area where your functioning or ideology is contradictory or at fault or worthy of critique, and then push it as hard as they can so as to make everybody feel guilty and fracture the consensus that's there. Another deal breaker comes if they say, for example, I was in a collective where some students said, oh, you academics should be sharing your income with us because we are very poor. And I was like, what the hell? You think I'm going to share my income with you, kid? So you can see that these are deal breakers inside of collectives. And then that kind of discussions that you have to be tactful in a certain way. What we did in Jump Cut was we settled on just saying, how did our work go for all of us today? And what could we improve in our work process toward this collective task of putting out a paper, and left off the discussions of what other people should be doing with their lives. One of the things that happens in many collectives is the teaching of skills. In other words, a lot of collectives feel that someone can enter with few skills and that the more experienced people in the collective will teach them skills as they go along. And I think that happened in Jump Cut. A lot of people learned the skills of writing better by critiquing manuscripts and by seeing the level of critique, and a lot of people did a little research so as to try and get a manuscript in better shape. We found that, for example, some people sent in interesting manuscripts but were not very good at footnoting well, and so one of our collective members might take a manuscript home and work on improving the footnotes. All of those kinds of things meant a lot to the people who were involved in the collective. And so in that way, working in a collective could be a source of empowerment for its members. And I think that that's been true all along. In terms of jump cut, well, for various reasons, the collectives waned. By the end of the 70s, the collectivity was between Chuck Kleinhans, John Hess, and myself, and that remained until the death of John and of Chuck, and here I am, putting it out myself with the help of a lot of people who communicate by email, by critiquing manuscripts, and by editing special sections.